This is the third video on the key area on evolution, and I did say that you were going to have 4 videos, but I think actually you might have 5 because I think I might split up one of the other ones a wee bit more. But anyway, this video here, on the title here, I've got types of selection for a quantitative trait. So we're going to have a So this is all about natural selection and actually sexual selection and how they're depicted. They can be depicted in 3 ways, which describe the fitness of a phenotype or how well a phenotype succeeds in an environment. And the 3 ways that we're going to be looking at are stabilising selection, directional selection, and disruptive selection. And I'll talk about those in a moment. But I want to just talk about what I mean, or what we mean by quantitative traits. Now you've got continuous variables, you remember from your National 5, you have discrete variables and you have continuous variables. Your discrete variables are things that fall into groups, and other variables are quantitative variables, such as, or continuous variables such as height and mass, skin colour, hair colour are controlled by lots of different genes, or many genes, and they are described as being due to polygenic inheritance. Now when we look at data such as height, we can make that data what we call quantitative. You know, we can put a figure to it. It's maybe a wee bit harder to put a figure to things like hair colour. I suppose you could give it some sort of percentage of colour or whatever, but certainly things like height and mass you can give some sort of quantitative figure to. And when you graph out the data for a continuous variable, you get something that gives you this normal distribution curve, it's called, this classic bell-shaped curve here. So what we're looking at here is, say we're looking at a characteristic such as height. What we're doing is looking at the number of individuals that have got height down here, the number of individuals who have got height here, number of individuals that have got height here. Now what you would tend to find is that the majority of individuals will fall in this area here, kind of a sort of roughly average height. But you will get some outliers, so you have people that are shorter, and you've got people who are a lot taller. And that would be the case probably in individuals. So what we're looking at here is, if you could imagine this graphed out, then you get this normal distribution curve. You looked at this before at National 5, so you should be familiar with this in for a continuous variable. Now, if something happens, if there's some sort of selective pressure that takes place, then this normal distribution curve that is here changes its shape or changes what direction it moves in. And that is what we are going to be talking about when we look at stabilising directional and disruptive selection. We're going to have a look at the shape of what the graph does, but we're also going to have a look at, well, why does it do what it does? So moving on, we're going to have a look first of all at stabilising selection. Now what we mean by this here is, over here we've got our normal distribution graph, and there's some sort of pressure against extreme variance. So what we're doing is we're talking about individuals that are at the extreme ends of this normal distribution curve, and that pressure favours the individuals that are in here, the intermediate, who have the intermediate versions of the trait, and that leads to a reduction in genetic diversity, because what happens is, because these individuals here and amongst here are favoured, these ones aren't, then they're going to die out. And what happens is you end up with a distribution curve that shifts in the way, and that's what these arrows were over at the other side. An example of that is, well, human birth mass remains within a range of 3 to 4 kilograms. Babies with a lower mass are more susceptible to disease. So a lower mass over here they're more likely not to survive. A higher mass can lead to difficulties during birth, so the baby might not even survive the birthing process. We'll have a look at some other examples as well for all of these types of selections later on in this video, after I've sort of gone through the shapes of these curves. This type of selection is called directional selection, and it's common during a period of environmental change. So the selection here, it favours a version which was initially less common, causing a progressive shift in the mean value. So what we're saying is, like, say over here, the example that we've given here is over at this side here are European bears. Now, when over here a lower mass for the European bears was fine, but what happened was that when the environment changed, so when it got colder, it was found that selection favoured animals that were larger. So the mass of the European bear started to increase, and you ended up therefore with a shift in the normal distribution curve, and you ended up with a shift in the mean. As larger bodies lose relatively less heat than smaller ones, then European bears that were a larger mass were more likely to survive. So the mean shifted over, and that is what we call directional selection. This is called disruptive selection. Now here what we're saying is that there's a selective pressure that's happening, and it selects for the extreme versions of the trait at the expense of the individuals that are here in the middle, the intermediate versions. And what happens is that results in a population being split into two distinct groups. And we will have a look later at something called sympatric speciation later on in the topic, but it's a driving force behind it. And I'll give a wee example of disruptive selection just in a wee moment with some different slides. But you'll see here you end up with a situation where you've got two sort of variants that are doing very well, and this intermediate group are not doing well. So you get a separate mean emerging over here and over at the other side. Practical examples of these types of selection. So here looking at stabilising selection. Here the average phenotype is selected for, while extreme phenotypes are selected against. So imagine we've got a species of bird and it's got variations in feather colours. They're white and black birds, those are the extreme phenotypes. But there's also grey birds, and that's the average phenotype. Now, in this example, the environmental conditions become overcast. So the grey bird is very well hidden from predators, whereas the white and black birds are easily seen. So the grey birds survive better and their numbers increase. You end up with a situation where you maybe initially your normal distribution curve was something like this. Well, actually, that's not very good because I've changed the height and things like that, but maybe something more, I should have had it, say maybe more like this, where you had more of the variance here, and then it would come up, and then more of the variance over here. But what happens with your stabilising selection is that the curve starts to narrow, because what we're doing is favouring these grey birds here in the centre here, and these ones here are going to be more easily spotted, and these ones here. So you get this narrowing of the curve. Here we're going to look at disruptive selection, in that the extreme phenotypes are selected for, while the average phenotype is selected against. So just to imagine that over time the environment has changed, the climate has got colder and snow's been there for a long time. The white birds are well hidden from the predators this time, but as well as that, a forest fire has broken out and it's left many trees burnt, so the blackbirds can also hide easily amongst those black burnt trees now. So it's only the grey bird that's unable to blend in with the surroundings. So its numbers drop as the white and the black birds increase. So the extreme phenotypes end up for. So you get this situation like this. Remember before in the stabilising selection, we had this situation here where the greys were being selected for. But now, with the environment changing, these greys are now no longer able to hide themselves. They're more noticeable on the snow, and they're actually more noticeable on the black trees as well. So what you end up is having these extreme phenotypes here doing better in the environment, and that is destructive selection, and you'll end up with two means. So now looking at directional selection. In directional selection, one extreme phenotype is selected for while the other extremes and the average phenotype are selected against. So imagine now the environment has changed again. The snow starts to melt, but the trees, however, have not recovered and are still blackened from the fire. So only the blackbird has good cover, and it can hide from predators, and it increases in numbers, while the grey and the white birds are easy prey and they start to decrease. So the black extreme phenotype is, and here's the directional selection here, where the numbers of blackbirds will increase and the numbers in grey and the white ones will decrease, and the distribution, the normal distribution curve, starts to move over towards this side here, and the mean will shift over. And that is the end of these types of selection for a quantitative trait.